The third headstone had my name on it and a time of death 4 minutes away, 11:42 p.m. It was 11:38 p.m. when I found it. I stood there, staring at it, trying to understand what I was looking at. Earlier that evening, a little after 11, I climbed over the side wall of the cemetery, my camera in hand. I run a small photography page. Old headstones get attention, especially worn names and faded dates. People like stones from the 1700s and 1800s. This cemetery has a section at the back with some of the oldest markers in the area. The main gate locks at dusk, but the side wall near the oak trees is low enough to step over. I've done it before in daylight. At night it feels different, but not enough to stop me. I dropped down onto the gravel path and stood still. The place looked wrong in a way I couldn't really explain, but every headstone stood upright, even the old ones. It's not something you normally see in an old cemetery. Headstones stood upright in straight rows, crosses rose evenly from the ground, and corners sat firm in packed soil. Every row lined up straight from one end of the cemetery to the other. The air around me was still. The oak branches didn't move, and beyond the fence the road was quiet. I started walking toward the older section at the back. My shoes sounded loud on the gravel. That's when I noticed it. A dark figure stood under one of the tall oak trees, holding a rake upright in one hand. The jacket it wore looked stiff across the shoulders, and heavy trousers hung straight to its boots. Mud had dried flat across the knees. Its boots were planted evenly apart, and the rake rested upright against its chest. Its head leaned slightly to one side. Its face looked pale in the low light, the skin across the cheekbones pulled tight. Its eyes were open and fixed on me. It wasn't blinking. I slowed when I saw the figure. The gate had been locked when I climbed in, and I had not seen a truck or any headlights near the fence. I told myself it was groundskeeping, maybe night work, and I kept walking. I reached the older stones and started taking photos. The camera screen glowed in my hands while I adjusted angles, zoomed in on worn lettering, and framed cracked marble and moss. I moved slowly along the row. Then I stopped. My name was carved into one of the headstones, Ethan Cole. The spelling was correct, and the birth year matched mine, but the death year was 1 year from now. I read it again, slower, because it did not register at first. Beneath my name, the inscription read, "Beloved Son." The grave looked like it had been there for many years. I stepped back and looked along the row. All the other names were strangers, and mine was the only one I recognized. I looked back toward the figure. It stood closer now, but I had not heard it move. I lifted a hand slightly, a small gesture to see if it would respond. It did not react. After a few seconds, I lowered my hand and turned back to the stones. I hesitated for a moment, then moved to the next row. There it was again. My name appeared once more with the same birth year. This time the death year was 10 years from now, and the inscription read, "Devoted Husband." The stone looked older than the first one, with softer edges and a thin strip of moss along the base. I turned slowly in a circle. The figure stood between the rows ahead of me, facing me, the rake upright in its hands. I moved faster, without breaking into a run. I cut across a narrow path and turned left, wanting distance from the stones and a clear path to the wall. When I turned another corner between two tall marble slabs, I saw it again. The third headstone stood ahead of me. My name was carved into it. The birth year was correct. The death date was today. The stone read 11:42 p.m. I checked my watch. It was 11:38 p.m. I lowered my wrist and looked back at the grave. The space beneath my name was blank. The soil in front of it lay open, and a rectangular grave had been cut clean into the ground. It had been dug properly. Fresh earth sat piled neatly to one side. The figure stood beside it with the rake upright, facing me. I stepped back and turned away. I moved quickly between the rows, cutting right this time instead of left. I passed a tall stone angel and a line of smaller markers. When I turned the next corner, the open grave stood in front of me again, with the same stone and the same blank inscription. The figure was already standing beside it. I changed direction and headed toward the front gate. The gravel path widened near the entrance, and I could see the iron bars ahead. The gate was locked, and a heavy chain threaded through the bars. I grabbed it and pulled. It held firm. I looked at my watch. 11:39. I turned around and saw rows of headstones filling the space behind me without a clear exit. I chose another direction and moved quickly between the rows. I was trying to put distance between me and that grave. I took another turn, and the grave was in front of me again. The stone still read 11:42 p.m. I looked at my watch, forcing my wrist steady. 11:40 p.m. The soil inside the grave looked darker now. I broke into a run and picked a direction between the stones. My shoulder brushed cold granite, and my shoes slipped on damp grass as I pushed forward. My lungs burned as I reached what should have been the far corner of the cemetery. The grave stood in front of me again. I checked my watch. 11:41. I turned sharply and ran again. I cut between two tall markers and turned too quickly. The ground disappeared beneath my foot. I dropped straight down. My shoulder hit first, and pain shot through my arm as my back struck the bottom. Dirt broke loose from the walls and slid down around my legs, packing into my sleeves and collar. When I looked up, the figure stood at the edge of the grave with the rake in its hands, looking down at me. The back of the headstone was behind it, blocking part of the sky. I dragged my wrist up toward my face. 11:42. The rake moved, and earth slid down into the grave in a steady pull. I forced myself upward, driving my boots into the side of the grave, but the soil crumbled under my weight. I grabbed the edge and felt the grass rip free in my hands. My fingers caught the base of the headstone, and I dragged myself out onto the ground. The grave stood open behind me. The headstone remained upright. It still read 11:42 p.m. The inscription space beneath my name was no longer blank. It read, "Beloved Son." The figure stood where it had been, with the rake upright. I ran. I reached the side wall, climbed over, and dropped onto the pavement outside. I kept moving until the gates were out of sight. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the grave. By morning, I needed to know if it had been real. I turned on the camera and started scrolling through the photos. Most of them were normal, showing old stones and faded names. Then the last image loaded. It was a picture I never took. It showed the open grave and the headstone with my name and birth year. The time of death still read 11:42 p.m. The date beneath it had changed. It was tomorrow.